In a world where the pace of life moves faster than most hearts can keep up with, where emotions rise and fall like unpredictable tides, there exists a deep yearning within all of us, a yearning for peace. Not just the quiet of a silent room, but the kind of peace that settles into your bones. The kind that holds your heart steady when the world feels like it's spinning too fast. This peace, this unshakable calm, isn't found in escape. It's uncovered in the presence of truth, in the stillness that Buddhism has long pointed toward. Not as a religion only, but as a path of understanding our own hearts. Imagine for a moment waking up and not being carried away by yesterday's regrets or tomorrow's worries. Imagine what it feels like to sit with yourself completely without fear or urgency. That is the foundation of emotional mastery, not a denial of feelings, not control over them, but the wisdom to see them as they are. Just passing clouds, movements, not permanent, not defining, and through the teachings preserved for centuries, we're reminded that no feeling stays forever. Joy comes and goes, sadness rises, then fades, anger flares and then softens. And in that understanding, there's freedom. He remembered the first time he sat alone with the intention of simply observing his mind. No music, no distractions, just him and the raw sound of his own breath. It wasn't serene at first. In fact, it was chaotic. Thoughts scrambled for attention. Old arguments resurfaced. Memories floated up like forgotten debris. But he stayed. He didn't chase the thoughts. He didn't run from them either. He just noticed. And that simple noticing, it changed everything. Because for the first time he realized he wasn't his thoughts. He was the one watching them. That's what mindfulness offers. Not a magic pill, not instant bliss, but the soft, unshakable ability to observe without judgment what arises inside you. And when you can do that, when you create that space between stimulus and response, you open the door to choice, to presence, to peace. It was in that space he learned that emotions, even the painful ones, had something to teach him. Anger wasn't the enemy, it was a signal, a boundary crossed, a need unmet. Sadness wasn't weakness, it was a call inward, an invitation to slow down and feel what had been pushed aside. Fear wasn't always a wall, it was often a mirror, reflecting where growth was calling him. And so he stopped waging war against his emotions. He began to listen, not to obey them blindly, but to understand the story they were trying to tell. Buddhist wisdom speaks of impermanence not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived truth, that everything is in motion, that nothing, not even pain, remains fixed. And the more deeply he embodied this truth, the lighter he felt. He stopped holding on so tightly, stopped gripping people, plans, outcomes like lifelines. He let things come and he let them go, like breath, like waves, like the seasons. And in doing so, something unexpected happened. He began to feel more alive. Because when you're not trying to freeze moments or trap feelings, you become present to the beauty that exists in the now. A laugh shared with a friend, the warmth of the sun on your skin, the silence between words that says more than noise ever could. These moments had always been there. He had just been too busy chasing something else to see them. He thought about the way he used to run from discomfort, the way he'd fill every moment with sound, with screens, with distractions, anything to avoid sitting with what hurt. But now he faced discomfort like an old teacher, sat with it like a wise elder, asked it what it came to reveal. And almost always it had something to say, not in words, but in sensation, in memory, in the quiet pull of intuition. And when he honored that, even the hardest feelings softened. They didn't need to scream when they were heard. He remembered the teachings of the Buddha not as doctrine, but as a mirror, an invitation to look inward, to slow down, to stop blaming the world for his unease, and start investigating the stories he told himself. He started seeing his reactions not as random, but as habits, grooves carved deep by years of repetition. But habits could be unlearned. The brain, like water, could be redirected. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. And that possibility that he could transform, truly, became the flame that kept him walking. Meditation wasn't always graceful. Sometimes his legs hurt, sometimes his thoughts felt louder than ever. But over time, it became less about the perfect stillness and more about the return. The moment he caught himself drifting and chose gently to come back. That act, the return, that was the practice. That was the power. Because every time he returned, he reclaimed his life from autopilot. He started using breath as a tool, not to escape the world, but to anchor himself in it. Deep inhales in moments of stress, slow exhales when anxiety gripped his chest. And the more he breathed with awareness, the more he remembered. He was here, he was alive, and that was enough. He learned that emotions didn't need to be controlled. They needed to be welcomed, held, witnessed, and that in witnessing them without judgment, they lost their sting. They became waves he could surf rather than drown in. And with that came resilience, not the kind that looked impressive from the outside, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that let him bend without breaking. The kind that kept him grounded in storms. He saw how often people tried to fix emotions instead of feel them. How quick they were to distract, to numb, to suppress. But he chose a different path. He chose presence. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. Because he was tired of running, tired of pretending. He wanted to meet life fully, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Because in that pain, he found truth. And in that truth, he found himself. He didn't need to change who he was. He just needed to remember who he'd always been, beneath the noise, beneath the conditioning, beneath the fear. And as he peeled back those layers, what he discovered wasn't brokenness. It was wholeness. Not perfection, but authenticity. And that authenticity became his compass. He stopped chasing happiness like a finish line, stopped waiting for all the pieces to fall into place before he allowed himself to rest. He rested now, even in the chaos, especially in the chaos, because peace wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a choice, a way of being. And as he walked this path, sometimes stumbling, sometimes soaring, he became more compassionate, not just with others, but with himself. He stopped measuring his progress with harsh eyes. He celebrated the small wins, the gentle shifts, the moments he chose love over fear, stillness over reaction, truth over comfort. Those moments he knew were sacred. This was the path, not linear, not easy, but real. And on it, he found not just freedom from suffering, but connection to himself, to others, to the vast, mysterious dance of existence. The more he stayed present with his inner world, the more he began to understand the nature of emotional suffering. Not just the moments of heartbreak or fear, but the subtle, persistent ache that had lived beneath his skin for years. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a dull tension in the chest, a slight unease that followed him like a shadow. He realized it had nothing to do with what was happening outside, and everything to do with the stories he had carried, inherited, repeated. Stories that told him he wasn't enough, that he had to prove his worth through constant giving. That peace was something far off, reserved for those with perfect circumstances. But now he saw the illusion for what it was. Peace had been here all along, waiting, patient, whispering beneath the noise. He remembered the first time he truly understood the power of impermanence. It wasn't in a classroom. It wasn't while reading an ancient text. It was in the middle of heartbreak, when the person he thought would stay forever left without explanation. At first, the pain was unbearable. It came in waves that knocked him off his feet. But as the weeks passed, as the sting began to fade, he noticed something miraculous. The sun still rose. The world kept turning. And slowly, so did he. The pain didn't vanish overnight, but it softened. It changed form. And one day he realized he could breathe again. That was the lesson. Nothing lasts forever, not the pain, not the joy. Everything passes. Everything transforms. Instead of resisting change, he started welcoming it. Not blindly, not recklessly, but with a heart open to growth. Because he realized that what he used to call loss was often life-making space for something more aligned, something more real. The friends who drifted away, the jobs that didn't work out, the doors that closed, they all served a purpose. They were redirections, not rejections. And in hindsight, he could see the grace in it, the invisible hand guiding him not toward what he thought he wanted, but toward what his soul needed. He let go of the obsession with control, that false sense of safety he once clung to, the belief that if he planned enough, worked hard enough, worried enough, he could prevent pain. But pain came anyway, unexpected, raw, illuminating. And in its aftermath, he saw the truth. Control was an illusion. Life wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be met, moment by moment. So instead of tightening his grip, he began to release it, to trust, to flow. And in that surrender, he found a strength he never knew existed. He explored the teachings more deeply now, not as a student collecting knowledge, but as a seeker embodying wisdom. The Noble Eightfold Path became not a list, but a rhythm. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action. These weren't abstract ideas anymore. They were daily choices. The way he responded to a rude comment, the way he showed up in relationships, the way he aligned his values with his actions. It wasn't about perfection. It was about integrity, about living in a way that didn't leave his soul aching at the end of the day. Mindfulness became his anchor, not just during meditation, but in the ordinary moments. Washing dishes, walking to the store, sitting in traffic. These were no longer filler moments. They were portals, opportunities to return to the breath, to witness thought without being consumed by it, to experience the fullness of now. He stopped chasing enlightenment in far-off retreats and began finding it in the present, in the mundane, in the deeply human. He noticed how often his suffering came not from the situation itself, but from his resistance to it. The stories he told, the shoulds he whispered to himself. This shouldn't be happening. They shouldn't have said that. I should be further along. But all those thoughts did was add another layer of pain to what already hurt. So he started replacing should with is. Not in defeat, but in acceptance. This is happening. This is what it is. And from that place of truth, he found his footing again. Compassion took on a new shape. It wasn't just kindness to others. It was gentleness with himself, with the younger version of him that didn't know better, with the present version still learning. He no longer pushed himself to be endlessly productive. He honored rest. He honored mistakes. He honored the sacred mess of becoming. And in doing so, he noticed he became more available for others, not from obligation, but from overflow. He let go of the fantasy that healing was linear, that once he reached a certain point, the old triggers would vanish, that someday he'd feel whole and untouched by pain. But healing didn't work like that. Sometimes the same wound resurfaced, dressed in a new disguise. Sometimes he stumbled. Sometimes he forgot. But now, instead of collapsing into shame, he smiled, gently, patiently, and reminded himself, this is part of it. Growth wasn't a staircase, it was a spiral, and every loop brought him deeper into truth. He began to recognize the difference between solitude and isolation. Isolation had once been a cage, built by fear, sustained by shame. But solitude was sacred. It was where he recharged, where he remembered, where he met his own soul in stillness. He didn't fear being alone anymore because he had made peace with himself. And when you are at peace with yourself, you are never truly alone. Gratitude became his ritual, not forced, not a checkbox, but a natural outpouring of presence. He noticed the warmth of the sun through his window and whispered, "Thank you." He felt the softness of his blanket at night and smiled. He drank water with awareness, breathed with reverence, laughed more, complained less. Not because life was perfect, but because he was present enough to see the beauty within the imperfection, and he redefined success. Once it had been about status, about validation, about keeping up. But now success looked like peace of mind, like being able to sleep without anxiety, like being able to feel without running, like having the courage to walk away from what didn't nourish his spirit. Success was inner freedom. It was the ability to choose what aligned with his soul, even if no one else understood. He saw that happiness wasn't something to chase. It was something to cultivate through presence, through values, through conscious living. He didn't wait for happiness anymore. He created it in small acts, in quiet choices, in deep breaths. This path wasn't always easy. There were days of doubt, days of fatigue, days where the world's noise threatened to drown his stillness. But through it all, he remained committed, not to perfection, but to awareness, to love, to peace. And that commitment, day by day, reshaped his life. As the days folded into each other, he noticed how the more deeply he honored his inner silence, the more effortlessly he began to witness the world as it truly was, not as he wished it to be. The noisy chaos of everyday life, the deadlines, the disagreements, the unfinished plans, still existed, but they no longer swallowed him. He could stand in the middle of it all and remain centered, not because he had mastered every technique or learned all the right answers, but because he had developed a new relationship with awareness. He wasn't living at the mercy of his reactions anymore. He was living in the steady rhythm of intention. That shift wasn't marked by grand events. It was felt most in the small, often invisible decisions. Choosing to breathe instead of snap back. Choosing to pause instead of flee. Choosing to soften when his instincts told him to harden. These choices became his medicine, not just once, but again and again. Because mastery didn't mean he never faltered, it meant he returned more quickly. And the more he returned, the more he felt a quiet confidence forming inside of him. Not the kind you announce, the kind you embody. He no longer felt the same pull toward conflict, not because he had become passive or indifferent, but because his peace had become too valuable to be wagered over things that no longer mattered. He saw that arguments were often just fear in disguise, two people trying to be heard without knowing how to listen, and so more often than not, he chose silence, not to avoid truth, but to protect it. He realized that not every battle deserved a warrior. Some only needed a witness, and witnessing with compassion sometimes brought more change than confrontation ever could. He saw that forgiveness was no longer something he gave as a favor. It was something he practiced as freedom. He used to believe forgiveness meant condoning harm or forgetting pain, but now he understood. Forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about him. It was about reclaiming the parts of his heart that had been occupied by resentment. It was about saying, "You no longer get to live in my mind, shaping my story." And so he forgave, not to erase the past, but to release its grip on the present. There were people he would never speak to again, words that would never be unsaid, moments that could not be redone. And still, he chose peace. Not because it was easy, but because it was lighter. Because carrying the weight of what-ifs and unspoken apologies was no longer worth the toll. He didn't need them to understand him. He didn't need closure from outside. He had found it within. He stopped needing to be seen to feel seen. Validation, once a hunger that shaped so many of his choices, began to lose its grip. He didn't crave applause anymore. He craved authenticity. He didn't post for approval. He spoke when his voice shook with truth. He didn't measure his worth in likes or praise. He measured it in integrity, in how closely his actions mirrored his values. And in that alignment, he found the kind of quiet confidence that no one could give or take away. There were moments still when the old patterns returned, when fear crept in, disguised as logic, when doubt whispered familiar scripts. But now he knew the voice of fear. He knew the taste of his old coping mechanisms. And while they still visited, they no longer stayed. Because now he had built a home for himself where those voices weren't in control. Where compassion sat at the head of the table. Where truth was welcome, even when it hurt. Especially then. He began to realize that life wasn't asking him to always be happy. It was asking him to be present, to be real, to meet each moment with openness, whether it was joy or sorrow, clarity or confusion. And this presence, raw, vulnerable, unfiltered, became his way of honoring existence. He stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and started asking, "What is this moment asking of me?" That single question changed his life. He noticed how often people hid behind perfection, how much energy was spent trying to appear okay, successful, strong, and he no longer wanted that. He wanted real, messy, honest. He wanted to be able to say, "I'm struggling," without shame. He wanted to be surrounded by people who didn't flinch when he cried, who didn't try to fix him, who simply stayed. And in choosing to live that way himself, he drew in others who were on the same path, not chasing perfection, but seeking truth. The more he softened, the more resilient he became, not because he hardened, but because he rooted deeper into what mattered. Peace wasn't found in detaching from life. It was found in engaging with it fully, with open eyes and a steady heart. He cried more now, but he also laughed deeper. He felt more. And in that depth, life became richer. Not easier, but fuller. More textured, more honest. He understood now why the Buddha taught the middle way. Not as a compromise between extremes, but as a path of balance, of not clinging to pleasure or resisting pain, of moving through life with grace anchored in awareness. This wasn't just philosophy, it was practical, it was real. He saw it every time he chose a balanced meal over binge eating to numb emotion. Every time he stepped outside for air instead of scrolling for hours. Every time he sat with his discomfort instead of seeking to erase it. He also discovered the sacredness of service, not as an obligation, but as a way of honoring the interconnectedness of all beings. When he helped someone, even in the smallest way, he felt his own pain ease. When he listened deeply without trying to fix, he saw healing unfold. He no longer needed to be a savior. He simply needed to show up with presence, with love, with humility, and that was enough. Even his understanding of love transformed. Love was no longer about possession or intensity. It wasn't about finding someone to complete him. It was about presence, about choosing to see someone fully and letting them see you. It was about supporting growth, not controlling outcomes. It was about space and closeness, breath and touch, silence and conversation. It was about being a soft place to land for yourself and for others. He found that when he lived from this place of presence, of awareness, of compassion, His relationships changed. Some ended, others deepened. But most of all, he changed. He no longer betrayed himself to be loved. He no longer lost his voice to keep the peace. He didn't shrink to fit. He expanded to be real. And those who could meet him there stayed. Those who couldn't fell away. And both outcomes were blessings. He no longer feared solitude because he had become someone he enjoyed being with. His inner world wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place of curiosity, of gentleness, of truth. He learned to laugh at his own thoughts, to sit with his own pain, to cheer for his own victories. He was his own companion now, and that changed everything. Each morning he woke not with a checklist of things to fix, but with a quiet intention, to live aligned, to breathe deeply, to love honestly, to listen fully. Some days he succeeded, others he stumbled, but he always returned. And that return, that sacred return, was the path itself. Each step forward on this path brought him closer to something ancient inside of him. Not a new discovery, but a long-forgotten remembering. As if his soul had always known how to be at peace, how to be whole, and the practices he was embracing were simply brushing off the dust. Like rediscovering a song he used to hum as a child, now playing faintly again in the background of his life. And every moment of presence, every conscious breath made that song louder, clearer. It was the melody of being alive, not as a project to be fixed, but as a miracle to be witnessed. He started paying more attention to nature, not just to admire its beauty, but to learn from its rhythm. The way trees let go of their leaves without resistance. The way rivers flowed around obstacles instead of trying to break through them. The way the sky held the sun and the rain without judgment. There was a kind of wisdom in the natural world that spoke directly to his nervous system. A silent invitation to slow down, to trust, to surrender. And in that surrender, he felt himself soften, not into weakness, but into presence. He didn't need to chase enlightenment anymore. He found it in the pauses, in the way a breeze carried a memory, in the laughter of strangers on a nearby bench, in the ache in his chest when a song said something he hadn't found the words for yet. Every ordinary moment shimmered with meaning, as if the divine wasn't far away in some holy temple, but right here, inside the folds of daily life. He didn't have to escape his reality to feel sacred. He just had to see it with new eyes. He began to unlearn the language of striving. For so long, his worth was tangled in how much he could achieve, how much he could prove. Rest was guilt, slowness was laziness, but now rest became an act of rebellion, a sacred pause, a way to remember that his value didn't increase with exhaustion. He stopped glorifying burnout, stopped admiring suffering as proof of purpose. He rested not because he gave up, but because he was learning to show up better. More grounded, more awake, more alive. And with rest came clarity. He began to hear the quiet whispers of intuition that had been drowned out by noise, the subtle knowing that nudged him toward truth. He no longer needed everything to make sense logically. Some decisions were felt, not figured out. Some steps were guided by something deeper than thought. And the more he listened, the more he trusted. Not just himself, but life. That it was unfolding. That it had a rhythm. That his role was not to force, but to align. He started seeing himself not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be honored. There was nothing wrong with him. There never had been. Just stories he had been told. Wounds he had carried. Patterns he had repeated. And now he had the awareness to choose differently, not from a place of shame, but from a place of reverence. Every scar, every shadow, every stumble, it all had something to teach. He wasn't broken. He was becoming. He no longer rushed to fix pain when it arose. He sat with it, breathed with it, offered it presence. And in doing so, he learned that pain, when held with compassion, transforms. It reveals, it softens, it integrates. He stopped labeling emotions as good or bad. He saw them all as guests, each one with a message, a medicine, and his job wasn't to evict them. It was to greet them with grace. He started treating his body with more love, not just through diet or exercise, but through presence, through listening, through honoring its signals instead of overriding them. He stopped punishing his body for not fitting someone else's ideal. He started thanking it for carrying him, for surviving, for adapting. Every breath was a gift, every heartbeat a reminder. I'm still here, still moving, still capable of change. He looked at his past with new eyes, not to dwell, but to understand, to offer forgiveness, to see the innocence in his younger self, the one who did the best he could with what he knew. He stopped blaming himself for staying too long in places that hurt. He understood now. That wasn't weakness. That was loyalty, hope, the desire to believe in love. And while it hurt, it shaped him. It taught him what he would never settle for again. He also forgave others, not because they deserved it, but because he did. He no longer wanted to carry the weight of resentment. It was too heavy, too loud, and he wanted his heart to be light, open, capable of receiving all the beauty that life still had to offer. Forgiveness didn't mean re-entering old relationships. It meant blessing them from afar, saying, I release you, I reclaim me. He began practicing compassion, not as an idea, but as a way of being. Compassion for the person who cut him off in traffic, for the friend who canceled plans, for the stranger who looked away. He stopped needing everyone to behave a certain way to feel okay. His peace wasn't dependent on others anymore. It lived within him. And when people acted out of their own pain, he saw it, not as a personal attack, but as a reflection of their own wounds. And in that seeing, he chose to respond with love, even when it was silent, even when it was simply walking away. He also began nurturing joy, not in grand adventures, but in small rituals. Lighting a candle before dinner, playing music while cleaning, taking a longer route on his evening walk just to catch the sunset. Joy was no longer a goal. It was a practice, a thread woven into daily life. And in cultivating it, he found himself more resilient, more present, more attuned to life's quiet miracles. He stopped needing to know what came next. The future, once a source of anxiety, became an open field, a place for possibility, not fear. He didn't need a 5-year plan to feel grounded. He needed presence. He trusted that if he kept walking, step by step, aligned with truth, the path would reveal itself, maybe not all at once, but moment by moment. And in this gentle unfolding, he came home. Not to a place, but to a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of living that honored the sacred in the simple, the divine in the ordinary, the truth in the silence. And in this home, he didn't need to perform. He didn't need to protect. He only needed to be. And being, just being, was enough. There was a sacred peace in how he now moved through the world, not hurried, not absent, but present in a way that felt almost rare in this modern age. It wasn't about detaching from the world. It was about meeting it with a different energy. He used to believe peace meant isolation, meant shutting the door on chaos. But now peace meant standing in the storm without losing his center. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. There was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before, a gentleness in his voice that carried the quiet power of someone who had returned to himself after a long journey of forgetting. He had once craved validation, like a thirst he couldn't quench. He sought approval in the eyes of others, measuring his value by how well he performed, how much he produced, how loved he appeared to be. But now that hunger had faded, not because he no longer cared, but because he had finally offered himself the acceptance he used to beg for from the outside. He could stand in a room without trying to impress anyone. He could speak without the need to be heard. He could listen without preparing a reply. That to him was freedom. That to him was power. He had stopped labeling everything as good or bad, right or wrong. Life had softened his edges. The very things he once cursed for breaking him had been the very things that built him. He realized that clarity doesn't always come wrapped in light. Sometimes it comes through loss, through grief, through the kind of silence that follows a door closing behind you. But when the dust settles, what remains is something truer than what came before. He didn't romanticize struggle anymore, but he honored it. He no longer needed everything to be easy. He only asked that it be real. His mornings changed too. They were no longer a race against time. They became rituals. He didn't leap out of bed to chase the world. He sat for a moment, listened to his breath, greeted the day like an old friend. He moved with intention, even in the mundane. Washing his face became a chance to return to the body. Making tea became an act of presence. He didn't need elaborate routines to feel spiritual. He just needed to be awake. Awake to his life, awake to the now. He began to find peace even in imperfection. A cluttered desk no longer meant failure. A missed deadline didn't unravel him. He allowed life to be messy because he had stopped expecting it to be anything else. There was grace in how he handled things now. He wasn't trying to fix every broken piece immediately. He was allowing space for things to be unfinished, for emotions to take their time, for healing to move at its own pace. Patience was no longer a virtue he had to force. It was a natural extension of his self-understanding. He redefined what it meant to be strong. Strength wasn't how long he could hold in his tears. It was how willing he was to feel them. It was in how gently he could speak to himself after a setback. How open he remained, even after being hurt. How often he chose to forgive, not to excuse someone's behavior, but to free himself from carrying it around. He saw that strength wasn't in the armor, it was in the courage to take it off. He started listening more, not just to others, but to himself. The inner voice he once ignored had softened, matured, deepened. It no longer screamed to be heard. It whispered, patiently waiting for him to return. And when he did, when he truly tuned in, he found answers that no book, no teacher, no sermon had ever given him. Wisdom had always lived inside of him, quietly buried beneath noise, beneath doubt, beneath the voices of the world. And now finally he was listening. He remembered an afternoon when he was walking through a quiet park, the air still, the sky beginning to blush with evening. He sat on a bench and simply watched the world. Children playing, an old couple holding hands, birds swooping across the fading light. And in that stillness, he felt it. Not happiness, not excitement, but a deep, unshakable contentment, a fullness, as if life was whispering, "This moment is enough." He didn't need more. He didn't need less. He didn't need to change anything. That moment was whole, and for the first time in years, so was he. His relationships evolved too. He no longer clung to people out of fear. He let connections breathe. He let people come and go. He didn't grip tightly anymore. Love, he realized, couldn't be forced, couldn't be earned through sacrifice. It had to be free. And the love that stayed, the love that met him with the same presence he had cultivated within himself, was the kind that healed, the kind that rooted, the kind that remained even in silence. He no longer felt the need to be understood by everyone. Some people saw him clearly. Others misunderstood his peace as indifference, his solitude as distance, his stillness as weakness. And he let them. He didn't argue with perception. He no longer handed out explanations like apologies. He let his life speak, let his energy speak, let his presence speak. And those who truly saw him saw without needing words. He no longer filled every empty space. He honored pauses in conversation. He welcomed the quiet. He stopped needing to entertain or be entertained. He found himself drawn to people who could sit in silence without discomfort, who could share space without expectation, who knew that connection wasn't in the talking, but in the being. Those were the people who felt like home. He had stopped living for arrival. There was no longer some grand destination he was chasing, no finish line that would finally grant him peace. He had spent years believing that once he reached a certain level of success, or healed enough wounds, or found the right partner, he would finally feel whole. But now he knew. Wholeness wasn't at the end of the path. It was in how he walked it, step by conscious step, moment by sacred moment. He laughed more now, not because his life was perfect, but because he had made peace with its imperfection. His laughter wasn't a mask anymore. It was a release, a celebration of all he had survived, of all he had reclaimed. He wasn't waiting for life to be easy to feel joy. He found it in the midst of difficulty, in the resilience of his own spirit, in the quiet miracle of still being here. He cried more too, and he didn't hide it. His tears weren't shameful anymore. They were proof that he was alive, that he cared, that he had opened himself to the full spectrum of feeling, grief and love, loss and longing. They all had space now. Nothing was exiled. Everything belonged. And in that belonging, he felt more human than ever. And maybe that was the greatest gift of all. Not enlightenment, not transcendence, but presence. A full-bodied, soul-deep return to what it means to be here, to be real, to be aware, to meet life with open eyes and an open heart. And in that awareness, he no longer needed answers. He didn't need everything to make sense. He just needed to be true, to live each moment as a sacred offering, to let life move through him, unresisted, unfiltered, unashamed. The further he walked this quiet path of inner truth, the more he understood that life was not a series of tasks to complete, but a series of moments to inhabit. And some of those moments would stretch him, test him, break him open just enough for light to slip through. Others would cradle him gently, like the warm glow of morning sunlight through a curtain. There was a wisdom unfolding in him, not because he had read all the right books or sat with the right teachers, but because he had stopped running, because he had finally decided to sit still long enough to hear the subtle voice within that had always known the way. He began to experience time differently, not as something to conquer, but as something to honor. Each second no longer felt like a grain of sand slipping away in some endless race. Now time felt sacred, a gift, not a burden. He stopped filling his days with noise just to feel accomplished. Slowness became a friend, not a fear. And in the quiet, he heard things he had missed for years. The sound of his own breath, the rhythm of his thoughts, the deep stirrings of intuition that had once been buried beneath urgency. He noticed how much of his pain had come from resistance. Resistance to what was, resistance to change, resistance to letting go. But now he was learning to lean in, to let life move the way it needed to. Like a river doesn't resist the curve of the land, he stopped resisting the shape his life wanted to take. He trusted that even the bends and the detours were part of the current carrying him exactly where he needed to go. There was a moment, quiet, unmarked by anything dramatic, when he looked around at his life and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the fleeting peace of getting his way, not the conditional peace of everything going right, but a deep inner steadiness that came from knowing he could meet whatever came with grace. that whatever happened outside, he had built a home within himself strong enough to hold it. That moment didn't need an audience. It was for him. And in that stillness, he wept, not out of sadness, but out of recognition, out of gratitude. He stopped apologizing for needing space. Space to think, space to feel, space to not have it all figured out. The world had taught him that stillness was selfish, that quiet meant something was wrong. But he knew better now. Stillness was sacred. It was the soil in which clarity grew. The more he honored that need, the more connected he felt, not just to himself, but to everything. The trees, the sky, the people he passed on the street. Everything became more vivid when he wasn't rushing past it. He also began to rewrite his relationship with discomfort. It was no longer the enemy. It was a guide, an invitation, a compass pointing to where healing still needed to happen. Instead of numbing it with distractions or fighting it with judgment, he welcomed it, sat beside it like an old friend, asked it what it had come to teach. And in doing so, he found that discomfort often carried messages wrapped in pain. Messages of boundaries crossed, needs unmet, truths ignored. And the more he listened, the more he understood. He didn't need to escape his pain. He needed to understand it. His sense of identity softened too. He no longer needed to define himself so rigidly. He didn't cling to roles or titles. He was no longer the version of himself that felt pressured to prove, to explain, to perform. He simply was. And in that being, he found a kind of wholeness that didn't need decoration. Some days he felt wise. Other days he felt lost. Both were welcome. Both were real. He didn't fear contradiction anymore. He understood that being human was to contain multitudes. He found strength in boundaries. Not walls, but doors with locks. He learned to say no with kindness, to say yes with intention. He stopped overcommitting just to avoid disappointment. He realized that people who truly loved him wouldn't leave because he needed rest. They would stay. They would understand. And the ones who didn't, that was a reflection of their readiness, not his worth. He stopped pouring himself into empty vessels. Relationships that took without giving, conversations that drained instead of nourished, situations where he had to abandon himself just to belong. He didn't see it as loss. He saw it as liberation, as clearing the field for something better, something reciprocal, something real. He was no longer chasing love. He was becoming it. And in becoming it, he attracted it, naturally, effortlessly, without having to beg for crumbs. He also stopped punishing himself for the time he had spent asleep. For the years he had lived disconnected, he didn't call it wasted anymore. He called it part of the journey, necessary, sacred even, because those years taught him contrast, taught him what peace wasn't, so he could recognize what it truly was. Everything belonged now, even the mistakes, even the heartbreaks,